Good evening. Good evening. Hello. Welcome. My name is Alice Simon. I'm an economics professor in the economics department. I'm also the faculty director of the Walter Amade Center for Economics, Business, and Entrepreneurship. And I welcome you to our annual Heisler Business Ethics Lecture. This is one of a few signature lectures from the Walter Amade Center. As you can see in your programs, this has been made possible by a generous endowment from the Heisler family. We are pleased this evening to welcome a wonderful speaker. I'm not going to tell you more about that until he's introduced. But I'd like to welcome members of the community, welcome members of my class, welcome members of other students of the community and faculty. President Jones sends his regards. He was unable to be here this evening. He is at a family wedding. But we have been able to work with Colleen Garland, who is an administrator for the school. And Colleen Garland is the Vice President of University Advancement. And before I formally introduce her to you, I would just like to say thank you, Colleen, for all the hard work. We have a team of people at the center. We have a team of people in University Advancement. And your support has made the efforts of both of us extremely easy to move forward. So we thank you on behalf of all the students in the programs. Colleen has had a 27-year career in fundraising, and she began in a grassroots fundraising campaign for the March of Dimes. She now leads a team of over 36 advancement professionals as the vice president for university advancements for this institution. And under her leadership, Ohio Wesleyan has enjoyed a very significant increase in gifts, including 3 consecutive years of more than $30 million of new gifts and commitments. She's also in the process of a new campaign. She is the staff architect of something called Connect Today, Create Tomorrow campaign, where more than $98 million has been pledged, and we are looking toward a goal of $200 million. And so we are so pleased that she is here with us this evening. Colleen Garland.
Thank you very much, Alice. It's really a pleasure to get to stand in for our president. I don't do this very often, and it's a real joy to be here tonight and to have the honor of introducing a person who I've gotten to know over the last couple of years. So let me start with Dr. Warlin's biography. Stephen Warlin founded San Diego-based Effector Therapeutics, Inc. in 2012 in an effort to develop a new type of treatment for cancer and other serious diseases, one that prevents the body from carrying out the harmful instructions of disease-triggering proteins. In addition to his leadership for Effector Therapeutics, Dr. Worland is also a member of the board of directors of San Diego-based Tracon Pharmaceuticals, which is working to create therapeutics to treat cancer and vision-related diseases. Prior to co-founding Effector, Dr. Worland served as president and CEO of Anidis Pharmaceuticals, which was developing treatments for hepatitis C and cancer. The company was acquired by Roche in 2011. Dr. Worland began his healthcare career in Argeron Pharmaceuticals and remained with that company through its successful commercialization of the HIV protease inhibitor and successful acquisitions by Warner Lambert and Pfizer. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree in biological chemistry from the University of Michigan and his doctoral degree in chemistry from the University of California at Berkeley. He later served as the National Institutes of Health postdoctoral fellow in molecular biology at Harvard. We are especially pleased to now call him a member of the Ohio Wesleyan family, as the parent of Katie Worland, and as a member, along with his wife, Joanne Chory, of our Parents Leadership Council on campus. So we're thrilled to have him with us tonight. I think you'll be fascinated by his experience as a scientist and an entrepreneur, and I'm certain you'll pose some challenging questions to him at the end of the talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Warlin.
Well, thank you, Colleen, and thank you, Alice. It's great to be able to be here today, and I'm somewhat flattered by the opportunity to give a talk. I'll say that the comments that I want to give today and the thoughts that I organized have been rumbling around in my head, some of them for 20 years or more. This is the first time I've ever lectured on the topic, so it's not a polished talk per se, but I will share with you my thoughts, and we'll take it from there. So let's see here. Yeah, so really what I want to talk about today is the importance of alternative perspectives in business ethics. So as I sort of thought of, how do I think about ethical situations that I've been in, and sort of what has been important in growing my own capacity to make appropriate ethical decisions and create a culture where that happens at the company and where it's second nature. One of the most important things is to hear voices from many different people. So I thought I'd give you a couple of examples of that, and then move on to a couple of issues that I see going forward in the future with regard to ethics for the particular industry I'm in, which, as you heard, is the biotechnology industry and the pharmaceutical industry, where we're focused on inventing new medicines that treat diseases that aren't very well treated today. So I thought it would be good to at least ask, well, what is business ethics? And so I won't read most of my slides, but to get this right, I'll quickly try to hit the highlights here. It can be defined as a critical and structured, I think both very important words, examination of how people and institutions should behave in the world of commerce. In particular, it invokes examination of appropriate constraints on the pursuit of self-interest or profits when the actions of individuals or firms affect others. So when the actions that you're taking impact other people, have you critically examined what you're doing, and have you critically examined the expected consequences of what you're doing? That was a summation of business ethics that really resonated with me. And, alternative frame, basically, principles, norms, and standards of conduct governing an individual or group, and I added in a business setting, but it's what you do. It's not so much, what you think and how you, what you think is right or wrong, but it's what do you do as judged by the impact that your actions have on other people who aren't necessarily vested in the positive outcome that you're working for. And so I think myself what's very important is the degree to which impacted parties have involvement in the decision. So if we're all in this together, we may be doing something right or wrong, but the impact of what I'm doing on you is not as critical an issue as if you had no say-so in the decision whatsoever, but you're still impacted by that action that I'm taking. And also, are there remedies available? So if there's potential negative consequences to somebody, if they have remedies themselves that they can invoke to try to combat that or to push back, if you will, that matters compared to people who have no way of pushing back at all. That's when you start thinking you're in an ethical zone where I have to ask myself, should there be constraint on my pursuit of self-interest? So it's simple, right? I was joking with somebody, is don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. It's going to be a short talk. That's business ethics. And the woman that I said that to is, I'll make it a little more complicated for you, Steve. It's do the right thing, always. People are more important than money. When in doubt, see number one. If you mess it up, own up to it, fix it, see number one again. So these are fairly straightforward in a way, and I think where it's obvious that you're just doing the wrong thing, you have your hand in the cookie jar, you're not reporting things correctly, that's a serious ethical issue. People don't always follow that, but it's well understood. You don't really have to give a talk in 2016 saying you shouldn't be cooking the books and you shouldn't be taking things from people that don't belong to you. So I wanted to ask, where is it a little bit more complicated? So it's not always that simple. Often in business, there will be competing interests. And so there'll be two parties in a negotiation, or they'll be trying to understand if they're going to work together. There's frequently appropriate processes for conflict resolution. If you're negotiating the price of a product with somebody, if you're negotiating a complex partnership, I'm at a little biotech company, we do big, complex agreements with large companies where we'll work together and they'll take over some aspect of the product at some point in time. There are processes for analyzing competing interests and for resolving conflicts. Where it's not a conflict necessarily, but competing interests. There are legal processes and negotiating processes. You should be able to stay on safe ground there pretty easily. Where it gets a little dicey is if there's the apparent win-win, and we're often look for the win-win. All of a sudden, people's standards drop a little bit. Maybe if the other party is very comfortable that they're happy with the deal. That doesn't mean, okay, that I can drop my guard. They're watching out for their own interests. We're good. It's actually sort of a numbing sense that you can drop your guard and say, well, hey, they're good with it. I'm good with it. Why do we need to worry about the ethics? So you kind of have to worry about that. it can be a justification for focusing on your own self-interest because, hey, they're looking out for their own interest. Everybody's happy here. Can't be an ethical problem. There certainly can be. And again, I think the fairness of that type of a deal is partly determined by the parity or not of the parties. So again, if I'm negotiating with a monster organization, they're more than on parity with me. I don't have to worry too much. Are they aware of their own self-interest? Do they have the capacity to identify and protect their own self-interest? Again, I negotiate with large multinational pharmaceutical companies. They have hundreds of lawyers looking out for their own self-interest. It doesn't raise my antenna and say, do I need to be extra careful not be taking advantage of them in a way? If they don't have even the same resources that I do at a small company, again, it raises the issue. They may be okay with it. We may both think it's win-win. Are they really competent to be entering into this negotiation with me? And even when I'm hiring people, if they're not as sophisticated from what some of the compensation aspects might be, I could put an offer in front of them and they'd say, okay, great, and we're negotiating, it's their job to protect their own interest. There are gradations in how sophisticated they are and how competent they are to protect their own self-interest. It's not necessarily my job to forget about my own interest and protect theirs solely, but as an ethical issue, I need to be aware of how competent the other party is in protecting their own interests, and just because we both appear to be happy with it doesn't relieve me of the obligation to ask whether that's appropriate deal to enter into or not. And then, most insidious, and what I wanted to talk about today is just a plain old lack of awareness. So, this is a real challenge to an ethical approach to business if you didn't even really think to ask the question. So, the scope of awareness in any situation is heavily influenced by who is invited to be in the room. So if you're not in the room, certainly it's hard to have your voice heard. Are people encouraged to speak up? Is this an environment where alternative perspectives will be heard because it's an environment where you're expecting people to speak up and you're creating a culture in which people feel enabled to speak up and feel like they're asked to contribute to the conversation, and that really depends on the value that's placed on these alternatives perspectives. So I can't increase my awareness of alternative people who may be positively or negatively influenced by what I'm going to do unless I make sure that I'm around those people. I've made sure that they understand I want them to speak up, and I made sure that I valued what they had to say when they do that. If I can create that type of a situation, then perhaps I can broaden my awareness of what consequences my actions might have where I wasn't otherwise aware of that, and that will increase my ability to pursue ethical decisions. So I wanted to just give a couple of examples of that. The first one is a career advancement. So a while back in my career, I'd recently been named the head of a group of about 25 people, and we had an annual review process really patterned after the academic institutions where you're looking for career advancement. I sort of led a process that I wasn't sole arbiter of the decisions, but in which we looked at merit, and it very much included contribution to the group. And we had a weekly group meeting where, this is a science company, science is presented, science is critiqued and debated, and a major criteria on my part for supporting somebody to be promoted to a higher title was what they participated in here. And I declined to support a particular promotion that had been suggested for a woman in the group, and she wrote a letter to HR and to my boss and the CEO of the company saying that this was gender bias on my part, that I hadn't supported her promotion because she was a woman. I was quite taken aback. I was angry as all get out. I couldn't imagine that I had been accused of this. I thought I was, one of the good guys. I had hired most of this group. They were half female. I had definitely, sought out making sure that there was parity in the hiring that we'd done. I followed my wife across the country so she could pursue her job. I was a trailing spouse. I mean, come on, I'm one of the good guys. How can you possibly accuse me of this? And she was basically threatening to sue me. And so when my boss gave me an interesting lesson in perspective, he goes, so these are words written in anger. I suggest you go talk to her first. Do be careful, because she is threatening to sue you, but rather than lawyer up here and let's go to town and start a fight, why don't you go ask her what's really going on? And so I sat down and talked with her, and it became clear over the course of that conversation, I placed enormous emphasis on this contribution at group meeting, and once she didn't really know how much I was sitting there keeping score, almost like who's joining the debate, who is not, and it became clear that she wasn't very comfortable in that setting. It became clear over the course, not in our first conversation, as I got to know her better. She was a lesbian woman. She felt very ostracized at work, and she just didn't have the social comfort to join in the fight and join in the intellectual debate. We weren't fighting, in person, but to join that debate. And so what I came away with that realizing is that, she had an antipathy to this verbal pushing and shoving that I thought was just great. We're in there, we're just duking it out, and we weren't trying to be smarter than the other person, but we were seeking the best idea by a very sort of kind of game-on version of scientific analysis, which is quite common in the academy. Doesn't have to be done that way. She had a total antipathy to this, and it was clear that there were people in the group who were less accepting of her personal nature than it didn't matter to me whatsoever, but there were people certainly that she didn't feel comfortable speaking up. So because that wasn't an environment in which her contribution was readily given to the group, we lost the benefit, so the group and the company didn't get the benefit of her ideas. There were overtly negative emotions that had been induced to her by not feeling comfortable to speak up, by not having an environment in which she could do that, and then having the negative consequences of not being promoted on that. And I failed to unlock her discretionary efforts. So every worker in every environment has the amount they can give you. The good workers give you more. No matter how hard or creative people are working, there's always more discretionary effort. The challenge of a good manager is to unlock that effort to say, I want to give even more. Part of that is what is the purpose of what we're doing, but also a big part of that is that there aren't negative consequences. So I had failed to get the best out of her because I didn't understand why she wasn't giving that best. And so there's an interesting summary of this sort of called psychological safety. And it's a team culture defined by interpersonal trust, mutual respect. Dr. Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School has been writing on this for about 20 years, in which people are comfortable being themselves. And so if you're in that relaxed, I'm totally comfortable, I can absolutely be myself, you'll put yourself out, you'll make challenging statements, you'll take the risk of saying, well, here's how I think the data looks in a science environment, and that may be completely wrong, but you're not worried about that. You're worried about getting that dialogue going. I had heard of this before I became more aware when Google did a Project Aristotle, where they went in and said, why are some of our teams just, killing it? They're just doing fantastic, and other teams aren't so good. It wasn't the average technical competence of the team. It certainly wasn't the, brilliant leader of the team or the charisma of the leader. It was who feels comfortable hanging out and talking with each other? Where will you get that extra creative contribution that comes from people being comfortable, having this psychological safety? And it occurred to me that for both the impact that I have on people and their comfort at work and their contribution to the work, and the impact that my group will have on the overall company's success, this rises to an ethical issue. Creating an environment in which people have psychological safety empowers people to give the most that they have to the company, and therefore the company does much better. And the reverse of that is a situation in which people are not fully comfortable being at work. So that's an example where I had thought I was running a completely fair, objective process that I would then judge people's contribution, but because it wasn't inclusive to include all the perspectives that should have been available to me in that room, we weren't getting as much out of the endeavor as we could have. That was more than 20 years ago now. One of the hallmarks now of the company where I work is we interview people and they tell me how much they love the environment when they come into work. And so it's been a major focus now of creating environments in which people are comfortable speaking up. And I believe that rises to an ethical level of running a company. Are you getting the most out of people? Are you creating situations where people are empowered to give everything that they have to you? And by the way, that's great for the company because when they give everything, it's a lot more than something. So I want to give a couple of examples and illustrating points in my own career where I decided whether I would move on or not. So some of you at dinner heard me talk about, and in Colleen's introduction, she mentioned acquisitions. Ultimately, there are two acquisitions that had me part of the largest pharmaceutical company in the world at the time, Pfizer. And it was described as the head of research and development, who was an ex-military guy. We're like an aircraft carrier heading out into our next tour into the North Sea. And he was very moved by that analogy. And I thought, and I'm standing on the bow, and if I took a dive off, nobody would notice. There are 100,000 employees in this company, and I had a relatively senior position, but this aircraft carrier is going to keep steaming ahead whether I'm here or not, and that didn't engage me. As part of 2 successive acquisitions, we'd engaged in very fierce integration exercises, we could call them battles, where all the various different sites of the companies fought for resources to say, we want to do these projects, we'd love to do some more projects. And it was sort of a zero-sum game. There was going to be so much money spent on R&D, projects were going to be allocated, jobs were going to be allocated according to that. And I fought to the last moment in which it was announced that I would lead substantial more effort than I was previously leading. And then I walked into my boss's office and said, I'm going to resign. And I had no ethical qualm whatsoever at that point in time because, again, this was Pfizer. They had all the money in the world. They had 100,000 employees. They didn't really need me. Up until that point, it was a very fragile site, and they could have lost half of their jobs. And so my boss, who ran the site, and I and 2 or 3 people, we went in and fought ferociously for as much work as we could do. The day that was announced and it was irrevocable on the part of the company, I felt no qualms whatsoever saying, but I'm not signing up for the next tour of duty. We're in port right now. The ship is safe. Everybody's on dry land. I'm not reboarding the ship for the next tour. Sorry. He was horribly angry with me at the time, but I still don't think that was anything, I don't think that was unethical. I think I was free to move there. The next time, not so much. So I was in a startup environment. We'd become overextended. We had an international site. We had no business having a site in Germany as well as San Diego. More than 100 employees. I had participated significantly in raising the money to run that endeavor. The R&D programs were at very sketchy stages at that point in terms of whether they'd succeed or not. It was a very stormy team dynamic at the senior team, and I was not at all happy working in that environment. And more than once, I came within days of leaving the organization, and I could never convince myself that it was okay to leave. I had raised the money. I'd hired most of those 100 people. We asked people to give us money so we were going to do something, and just because the behavior of a couple of people made my life unpleasant, that did not rise to the criteria in the first instance. And it had to do with the impact of on other people of my action. In this instance, on the first case, nobody lost their job. They put somebody else in my position. They were either good or not at it, but had no impact. Lots of these people would have lost their jobs. The investors would have lost their money. And I didn't come to the conclusion it was ethically appropriate for me to leave at that point in time. So I want to switch gears here now and talk a little bit about process in business and how I consider that have an ethical component there. And I want to make a point that competence in business decision making can actually rise to the level of an ethical issue. And I think you'd normally think of competence being either people are competent or not, but that wouldn't rise to a level of ethics. If people who grant me the authority to make decisions, they've picked me, they're pretty involved in the decision making. And if I avoid the obvious ethical lapse, again, I'm cooking the books, I'm taking money into my own pocket, it's a fair exchange. They picked me for the job, we're in constant dialogue, they can fire me anytime. As long as I haven't misrepresented my competence for the job and I'm not lying, cheating, or stealing, it's not really an ethical issue, it's just a business competence issue. But there are many, many other stakeholders who have little or no influence in whether I'm the person who gets to make the decision, yet are equally just as much impacted by the quality of the decisions. Employees, I mentioned before, business partners who may not be in particularly strong positions themselves, and in our business, patients as well. So if I screw up the decisions on what projects we should pursue and how we should pursue them, there are patients who suffer here. So again, the ethical component being people who are impacted by my decisions, the actions that I take, who have no ability, no participation in the decisions, and maybe no remedies. And so I would say that this makes the quality of my business decisions a matter of ethics. And the greater the disparity between the impact somebody might have on my decision and the influence it would have on them, the more my antennae need to be up, and I need to consider the ethical consequences of the decision that I'm making. So I want to digress for a minute then and talk a little bit about leadership style and how decisions get made in organizations. And so there's many different styles of leadership. I just pulled out a few that will be familiar to many of you who studied organizational behavior and sort of business management. Oftentimes, small companies, they have a sort of a charismatic leader who's rallying the troops. This is what we're going after. It can be very inspirational to people. It's limiting in that person frequently isn't listening to other people in the room as much as, we need to go take that hill, and don't talk to me about the other hill. That's where we're going. So you lose the impact of other people. Abraham Lincoln is famous for championing his cabinet, which he called a team of rivals. I hate this idea. I think it's one of the worst ways to organize business whatsoever, although it's quite popular. It broadens input, but you inherently have people who are competing with each other for their idea to win. And it may get modified a little bit, but the ideas competing with each other always become the people who brought that idea into the room, trying to win, trying to get my idea over your idea. I've never seen it where if you come in with sort of this team of rivals, we'll both try to compete to tell the boss what's the best idea. It's always a rivalry, and I think that frustrates the ability to incorporate other perspectives. There are people who advocate consensus, where you listen to everybody, you get the broadest input. I have a real problem with that because too often you get the lowest common denominator. You get that idea that nobody will object to. That's not the same thing as the best idea. The best idea may frustrate people, may challenge people. So I'm not a fan of consensus either. And I came up with a term myself. It may have been used before, but for the purposes here, I'll say I just made it up, called synthesis. And I'll tell you how I think about that in a minute. Here's Donald Rumsfeld, who ran the Defense Department, and I listened during the Second Iraq War, the generals who objected to the pursuit of the war and troubles that they had. And I'm not here to discuss the merits of having gone into the war, but what you heard was the critiques of outcomes. They really were based in a deep mistrust of the decision-making process. And if you thought trivially, you didn't listen to me, you didn't even pay attention to what I said, it wasn't that, it was that your decision-making process to go to war and how you prosecuted it didn't even factor in anybody who disagreed with you. And there was perception that risks had been overlooked rather than incorporated into the planning. And listening to that is when it sort of crystallized in my mind, oh, that's the opposite of what I do. What I do is synthesis. And I thought of synthesis as a leadership behavior, and then I even said it's not. It's how does the group behave? Am I behaving as a leader in a way that the group follows, what I would call synthesis as a group behavior? So it's a sort of process of iterative discussion, back and forth. Ideas are weighed, input comes in and out, and you do analysis of potential actions and what are the expected consequences. And it's a discussion and a dialogue. It expects and requires all the team members to speak up. You have to create an environment, the group does, and I have as a leader have a big influence on that, to create an environment in which people are comfortable speaking up. They have that psychological safety to do that. And then, the best idea is really a product of the discussion. This is what's so powerful about this. By the time we're done doing an hour of this exercise, the idea doesn't look like any idea we came in with. So it's not idea B beat out ideas C, D, and E. It's not a competition of ideas. It's a fusion, a synthesis of parts from this idea and other idea. And what I also came to sort of recognize, I hadn't consciously thought about this, is if people express reservations about a plan that begins to emerge, it can change the plan. It can even lead you to abandonment. Often as the plan begins to gel and people are going, this is pretty good, someone's still saying, but I'm worried, have you heard me? And so you can put in place sort of a check system that says, we'll start down the course we're agreeing to, but you're right, that is a legitimate risk, so we'll put in an early monitoring and we'll be aware of if that's coming to impair our plan. We'll know it very early on because we were, aware of anticipating the future. We looked for it as soon as it could possibly be seen, not when it blew up in our faces and went, oh no, what happened? We were looking for the problem, and we're looking for the problem because thank you, you warned me about the risks of that program. When you do that, you end up with two things. You end up with much more robust plans because now you've vetted it through there and you have installed business processes that will tell you if it's starting to go sideways the way the person was worried about, maybe we can still have a chance to correct it, or maybe we should abandon right now early. And you also get much more buy-in because the person who's expressing reservations, if you've built the culture right, doesn't need to have their idea win. They need to know that I was heard and you valued what I had to say. And when you say, okay, so that risk, we'll incorporate that risk, awareness of that risk by putting the following monitoring on our plan, you've now got a much better plan and you've got much more buy-in. So I would call that synthesis and really as a group behavior, not as a leadership behavior per se, but driving our group to behave in that way. So many of you may have seen in some of your classes as sort of a Z diagram. I've altered this a little bit to be to the way that I think it ought to act, but people describe sensing, gathering of information, intuition, brainstorming of possible outcomes, thinking as analytically, and this is where I've changed the definition you'll frequently see. People talk about thinking as weighing the outcomes. I actually think you have to analytically challenge, is that really the right predicted outcome? We don't have all the information, but if we take the following set of actions, is this the expected outcome? And then when you've agreed upon those, then you must invoke your values and say, what do we think of those outcomes? Do they violate our value system? Are we ultimately going to end up with a consequence that violates what we believe is appropriate? Again, many versions of the disease that you'll see in textbooks have the assessment of the outcomes doing here. I have altered it because I think you have to be very rigorous about predicting the outcomes, almost as if you have no ethical considerations, don't care. And then when you have the best analytical prediction, flip on your value systems and say, that's okay, or no, I'm not okay with that. And that's a critical part of that process as well, of course. Where the alternative perspectives comes in is in a couple of places, really brainstorming the outcomes. If you have a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds, you'll hear a lot more ideas about, well, hey, we could do this, or maybe we ought to try it that way. If everyone went to the same school and comes from the same background, they'll propose the same 3 ways of solving every problem. So you have incredible value of alternative perspectives in what are the solutions proposed. And then you also have, of course, different perspectives, different backgrounds and perspectives on life will arrive at different value decisions. And so you need to hear from people who may have a different value system than your own, but say, that really gives me a problem. And you go, oh, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, you're right, that's an issue. So those are the 2 areas where I think the alternative perspectives provide the most input. Of course, failing to apply this system is, I think, would be broadly recognized as unethical. You can't say we're going to set on a course of actions and I don't care whether, what the impact is on other people other than except maximizing my profit. Most organizations, and I think most people would say that's unethical. I'll argue that prematurely bringing this in so that you degrade the quality and the analysis of this process here also has an unethical consequence. I wrote the slide, it's just as unethical as ignoring the outcome. I couldn't bring myself to leave that because I think we do differentiate between willful disregard and ineptitude that ends up causing harm to other people. There is an ethical distinction, but if you degrade the process of predicting outcomes because too quickly what people do who bring the values in early, they perturb the prediction process to make sure that the one that they think is wrong doesn't end up scoring very well. And I've seen that happen over and over again. And I think that has a negative consequence on the people who could be impacted because you're not predicting the outcomes correctly. And ultimately, that's an ethical lapse as well. It's not as bad as ignoring impact on other people, but it is an ethical lapse. So with that as a background, in the last sort of 20 minutes or 20 or 30 minutes, I wanted to turn to healthcare. And so I'm in the healthcare industry and wanted to comment on what is the real challenge in healthcare from an ethical perspective. And so I hope I could convince you that we are in the most exciting time in biomedicine ever, and every advancing field will feel that way. But the advancement is just remarkable. Sequencing of the human genome and personalized medicine that can come from that, leading to a much deeper understanding of disease mechanisms and where we might intervene, and innovation that has fundamentally changed the outcome in diseases. So over the course of my career, I've participated in 2 dramatic waves. I started in the late 80s. HIV/AIDS was just coming onto the awareness of the biomedical community, and we would go to the International AIDS meeting. Every year, the death curve would march up. They would say how many people were dying from AIDS. And in 1995, for the first time, we saw it actually bend over, come down. And today, it's largely in the Western world where medicine can be provided and distribution systems are there, it's largely a treatable disease. Even more dramatic in a way is hepatitis C, where 95+% of the people who are treated for hepatitis C today can be cured. 10 years ago, that was 10% or less in the real world. We've basically taken a disease that ravages your liver and said, in a few months, we'll treat you and you will be cured for your life of that disease. We're starting to see in cancer where now in certain tumor types, 10 to 15% of the patients are cured. They are 10 years after their therapy and there isn't a touch of cancer detectable in their bodies. We don't understand why they respond and the other people don't, but we're just on the verge in cancer as well. And that's why I decided to go back from the viral world to resume efforts in the cancer area. But so I think there's no question about what we've done, dramatic things to alter the course of disease and to save life. I think that capacity to save life and relieve suffering, it resonates with our most fundamental human values. I don't know anything more than seeing somebody who might die, saving that life or relieving suffering, that it goes as deep to our values as anything. unequal access to that health care conflicts equally much with our our most fundamental human values. If you could save a life, relieve suffering, and that doesn't happen for some reason other than failure of science to deliver, that again conflicts with our values as much as providing that care does resonate with our value. And so I think the question that we face, and as an industry, our most fundamental ethical question is, how can we achieve the innovation that will continue to drive what we've seen at the top and universal access to those healthcare advances? And I'd ask, is healthcare unique in this need to achieve innovation and access? I don't really worry if my neighbor has the latest iPhone or not, or the latest smartphone. I don't really care if he's on a 4 or 5 or 6. It doesn't really touch my values and say that's wrong. If I could treat his disease and that's not happening, that resonates with me in a much different way. So I do think healthcare is different than many technology enterprises. I want to offer a couple of unlikely comparators that I think have the discussion that happens in society actually should be some of the parameters of that discussion matter in the healthcare discussion. And one of them is national defense. And you'll hardly ever hear anybody bring up national defense and and healthcare as parallels of each other. But it's assumed to be required for a healthy society. We assume, and I'm talking here about not wars of aggression and wars of material aggrandizement, but actually national defense if we're under attack. I think it's presumed to be required for a healthy society. Innovation is always heavily emphasized in pursuing advancement of our military capabilities, again, hopefully for defensive purposes. Actions are chosen based on the predicted outcomes. We worry about expense, but we don't really say, well, I'm in for the Iraq war at $2 trillion, but 2.5, that's too rich for my blood and I'm out, let's go ahead and that's not really a component. Once you decide what you're going to try to do, you look for efficiencies, but you're not really making a monetary value decision. You're making an ethical decision what you should or shouldn't do. And there's a presumed benefit for all. Of course, it would be ridiculous to say, well, if you live in Nebraska, we're going to defend you, but if you live in Colorado, they may come and invade. Sorry, there's an inherent definition. It's for everybody's benefit. And there's an assumption that there's a contribution from everybody. The duty to serve is not spread widely anymore, but the expectation that taxation will be used to create systems that will provide national defense for everybody inside the border, it's just presumed in the debate from the discussion. And we talk about how we should deploy that capability and could we do it a little cheaper, but we don't argue some people should get benefit and some people don't. Another one is education. Again, I think it's assumed to be required for a healthy society. There's certainly innovation, and we see more of it, but it's tempered with retention of long-standing methods. The Socratic method, I'm sure some of you experienced in class, is 2,500 years old. There's a sort of simultaneous emphasis on effectiveness and cost and expanded access, but they all somewhat compete for priority in the discussion. Again, there's a benefit provided to all, and up to a point it's compulsory, up to whether you're 16 or through secondary education. The presumption that education is so important for a functioning society, it's mandatory. It's not something you have a right to do, you're required to do it. And payment for this is coupled to the beneficiaries and those who are obligated to provide, often that's parents who are obligated up to a point, but it's supplemented with societal resources. We touched on this at dinner for a moment. Just paying for local and secondary education through property taxes, it was pretty clear that there's great disparity in the quality of the education, and so counties and states and the federal government step in and supplement payment by the people who directly benefit from a more homogenized resource pool, i.e. from some form of taxation outside of the immediate local real estate taxation, because again it's deemed to be important for society to function. Everybody needs access to this. I'm also somewhat drawn to the compulsory. I do think it's very important that participation in healthcare has an obligation component from the patients as well as the companies. I certainly am willing to pool my genetic risk with everybody else and say you can't pick the genes that you got with. We better throw in here together. I'll say that's probably a lousy deal on my part. 3 grandparents and both parents lived to be their 90s, so it's probably a lousy deal for me to share genetics with the general pool, but that's okay. That's part of being a human. If you want to sit on the couch and eat potato chips and watch TV, and you want me to buy your diabetes medicine, I go, well, wait a minute. What are you contributing here? Are you also doing the compulsory part? And I don't have a solution for how you compel that, but part of the debate is, are you doing, when you're asking for access to medicine, have you done everything you possibly can within normal realms to also try to protect your own health, or have you been very careless about that and now you want me to pick up the bill? That changes my perception of whether I like providing it or not. At the end of the day, I don't think you can deny anybody access to medicine based on their behavior, but it does change people's willingness to contribute in that way. So I wanted to give a couple of U.S. statistics here just to sort of set the stage. So now we're in the fact-gathering stage of my Z. I went to two sources, CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and IMS, which is an industry organization. They sort of have competing agendas, which CMS is trying to say the pharmaceutical industry charges every last price possible, and IMS is trying to make the case for the industry that we're delivering incredible bargain to society. So when their two numbers come close to agreeing, I figure I'm probably pretty close. At the bottom of the slide, I couldn't do quite as well. But, so let me go back for a minute. So $3 trillion spent annually on healthcare, and this is all forms of healthcare, hospitalization, in-home care, and everything. That's 17% of GDP, and you know, you'll frequently hear that must be something wrong with our society. We're spending 70% of our money on healthcare, and I thought, so if we did that, 20% on education, 10% on music, and 10% on literature, that's an enlightened society to me. We're spending substantial societal resources on preserving human potential, preventing death, preventing suffering. A priori, this number being big isn't a bad thing. It actually could reflect an enlightened society that is choosing, has enough excess resource available through the creation of wealth, and is choosing to allocate that wealth toward maintenance of health of society. That doesn't raise my alarm bells and go, something's wrong there. We spend about 12.5% of that on pharmaceuticals, medications, pills, injectables, and whatnot. So that's about $380 billion. That's $1,000 per U.S. resident. And the net costs are increasing because there are list prices and discounts, but the actual real price is increasing about 3 percentage points faster than the inflation rate per se. And it is also contributing to the inflation rate. So there's clearly a contribution of rising healthcare costs in real dollar terms to inflation. But I do like to make the point, it's 12.5% of the total spend. So you could nationalize the industry, produce every medicine that's been invented today at cost. This number would drop by about 75%, and you would hardly make a dent in the healthcare expense. So when you hear people rail that the pharmaceutical industry is the cause of wildly growing healthcare, we're 12.5%. We don't grow as fast as some of the other courses, and again, you could zero out the cost of all pharmaceuticals and hardly change the cost of healthcare in the United States. So that's not a solution that will actually have any impact that we're looking for, any positive impact. There's about 4 billion prescriptions written annually, so that's about 13 per person. So everybody in the country on average receives 13 prescriptions a year, which kind of was a surprise to me. I wouldn't have thought the number was as high. I do want to point out that 88% of those prescriptions are written for drugs that no longer have patent protection. So we would call those generic drugs where they were invented, somebody got a period of exclusivity, they got a legal right to a market monopoly, and then that legal right expired, and now anybody can make that drug. 88% of the prescriptions are written for generics. 72% of the dollars are still spent on the drugs with patent protection because, of course, the patent supports a much higher price than the absence of a patent. But it is important to recognize that the system that a very liberal Democrat from LA and a very conservative Republican from Oregon, Henry Waxman and Orrin Hatch from Utah put in place 25 years ago now actually works. Almost every prescription written in the United States is not for a patent-protected drug, and they set up a system that said we will basically spawn the development of a brand new industry that copies everybody else's drug as soon as the patent expires, and they'll all duke it out on efficiency of production and efficiency of distribution, and those drugs are sold for a few percentage points more than it costs to produce them. For a period of time, there's patent protection, and you can't do that because the patent gives the inventor of the product the right to preclude other people from doing that. But over time, even miracle medicines do become dirt cheap generic medicines. The question, of course, the challenge is in the interim before they become protected. And I'll have to admit, now my numbers get a little fuzzy. I couldn't find true agreement on this, and the current federal government likes to say the rate of insurance has gone up dramatically with affordable health care it has. I think most people wouldn't argue if I said at least 10% of the population still has no access to health care, and even greater problem, there are still dramatic disparities in access and outcomes that can be attributed to income, race, gender, other factors that conflict with our values. Again, so if you say you don't get access to the medicine because of your income or because of your race, because of your gender, where you live in the country, there's clearly something seriously wrong with that. How could access to my miracle medicine be dictated by any of these factors? And I would put in there including income. Humans are humans. If I've invented a drug that will save a life, I don't want to be frustrated in the application of that benefit to the person who needs it by any of these factors. And the fact that there is a disparity conflicts fundamentally with my values. So somehow we need to resolve this. We need to be able to recognize what is a legitimate part of the debate. The pharmaceutical industry is not the cause of grossly out of control healthcare expense, and all we need to do is rein in the greed there and everything will be good again. That's nonsense. But also it's nonsense to say everything's good, it's okay. It's not okay. We don't have sufficient equal access. So if you begin to think about innovation and cost and access, the current system is described as market-driven innovation. And in most industries, the market will drive innovation and the market will price innovation and the market will decide for something that delivers this much more value, we'll pay this. The pharmaceutical industry really doesn't operate as an efficient market. There are many challenges to a market-driven price discovery. Markets, when functioning correctly, will identify a price at which willing parties are willing to exchange goods and money, and a component of that will be, what does this do that something else doesn't do? There are several reasons I believe that the pharmaceutical business doesn't operate as an efficient market. One, the single largest participant in the market is precluded by law from participating in price negotiations. That's the U.S. government. About 30% of those dollars spent are spent by the government, primarily the U.S. government or state governments that are going to be reimbursed. They're not allowed to negotiate on price by law. They get a discount from the best price, and there's lots of policy arguments whether the government negotiating on price would drive price lower. I would say the burden of proof lies on those people who say it wouldn't. It seems to me quite ludicrous to think that taking the biggest player out of the market who would negotiate on price doesn't have an effect of continuing to keep prices up. You have to prove that to me. That sounds ridiculous to me. Equally challenging is the intermediaries in the process that separate the buying decision from the assessment of value. So typically those will be health insurance plans, whether they're employer-sponsored or government-sponsored. Most people aren't really looking at this and saying, for this benefit, I'm willing to pay this dollar, I'm not willing to pay that dollar. You just don't really make value-based pricing decisions when you're choosing your health care. And for a market to really function effectively, there needs to be transparency between the decision to buy and the value delivered by that. And that will always be messy. I mentioned before patents. They support near monopolies. I'm an inventor, of course. I believe very strongly that the patent system is a good thing. It goes all the way back to the Constitution, where the drafters of the Constitution wanted to promote innovation by instituting a patent system. But the system does work the patent system to its extreme. I don't think you can expect any single company to not pursue the maximum patent protection they could pursue. I think Congress can change patent law, can explicitly instruct the patent office, we want this patented, we do not want that patented. And you'll find the extensions of patents from 17 years to 27 years to 35 years for really very incremental changes in the end of that continue to promote high prices long after they need to be promoted for the health of the industry. So I'm not at all in favor of taking intellectual property or negating patents that exist. I'm very much opposed to the industry practice of, I think it's very bad for society that industry does that practice. You can't expect them not to until the law is changed. I very much believe that Congress needs to rewrite patent law to limit it to the fixed period that we originally envisioned, and then any incremental innovation from there is basically done by companies not seeking patent protection. And then, again, one of the hardest things is societal discomfort putting a price on life. And so there are people who believe inherently that's unethical. I would challenge that to say, if you're willing to say, this is what we'll pay for an extension of life, we'll pay much more if life is extended without any morbidity. Should we really pay for an extension of 6 months hooked up to the tubes and life is horrible? Of course, you don't know ahead of time where that is. But we have to have some conversation about what is it that will pay for curing a disease that would have killed you 10 years from today, and you're lickety-split clean, you are cured. You have to be willing to put a dollar value on that so that innovation will drive to create that cure. And I've given you examples now where that has worked. I think it's, the opportunity for a high return of investment has undoubtedly driven the investment. The advances that I talked about in medical care have largely been driven by companies pursuing a very high-priced medicine, and they've delivered. They've cured diseases, they've changed human life, and the connection between the return on that investment and that outcome is very direct. It's also undoubtedly true that high prices limit access, and so that's the challenge coming up with a system that will promote innovation and also still provide access. I think that was okay, so basically, you know, what is the right price? And anytime somebody asks me that question, I stop and say, well, wait a minute, what mechanism will you use to determine price? A debate about what the price should be is really an underlying disagreement about what mechanism we should use to determine price, and you need to start the discussion right there. I think focus on access without reflecting on the impact of setting particular prices would have on future treatment, I find that quite unethical because we've invented treatments for diseases today. There are many diseases that we could treat and even cure in the next 10 to 20 years. If we ignore the impact of any decision we take on that future innovation, I frankly find that unethical. There are patients whose disease could be treated in the future, and any system we put in place that substantially inhibits that, it causes me great problem because I know there's opportunity to treat disease and we're negating it. And so ultimately, I think drug prices have to reflect our collective willingness to buy a benefit and our willingness to forego that benefit if we didn't buy it. There's two sides of the coin. I will say I don't think, no argument about the level of R&D spending that went into inventing the product, that's utterly irrelevant. I don't go into the Apple store and say, well, how much did you spend on R&D in this and what do the components cost? I look at it and say, is this worth $200 in a plan? My buying decision in technology has nothing to do with the cost. If it costs you too much to develop this for what I'm paying it, don't make the product. But the R&D cost is utterly spurious argument on the part of the industry that justifies prices. You know, I also will say no amount of publicly funded basic research that is sort of the substrate we work upon justifies a low price. If you have a society where fundamental research is funded at universities and at nonprofit academic centers, that work is available for all companies to build upon and to invent products, that some of the very early work was done at communal expense, I don't think it all changes the dynamic that if you pay somebody for taking that first step and taking the other 100 steps to invent a product. So I think both of these arguments for high price and low prices I find to have no merit whatsoever. And I also say price discovery will be never as efficient as when I can walk in and buy an Apple or I can walk in and buy a Samsung. It's not going to be that efficient because of all the problems, the challenges I mentioned on the previous slide. That's okay. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be perfect. But if we can engage in a discussion that says, here's what I'll price this innovation, innovation will continue to happen, and then you have to ask, how are you going to distribute that? Let me just see where we are time-wise. And so I think this is, the concluding slide then, sort of options to consider, and then we can entertain some questions. We could certainly continue as we're going. Innovation will continue to happen at an accelerating pace as knowledge accumulates, but we'll have unequal access. You could have the government set prescription prices and mandate access. And really, for them to mandate access, that means they're going to set the price. There will be only one payer in the marketplace. In every instance I can think of, with maybe a possible exception I'll mention, that has destroyed the drive for innovation because now there isn't the opportunity to discover the right price for an innovation and to find the people who will pay for it, and the drive to invent something new that didn't exist that will treat disease. I think this will have a very negative consequence on innovation. We could engage in a messy discussion about pricing real innovation and real benefit, and what is it that we think as a society we want to pay and we can afford to pay for extending life and for treating disease. I think you have to take the uncomfortable step and have a dollar value placed on that, and that should be a negotiation between the inventors of products and society and who is paying for those products. And you have to have that, and you have to enact a commitment to access, and I think the only way to do that, you go back to the national defense and the education examples that I used, is through taxation. So I was standing at a meeting in San Francisco of all of the biotech industry and the banking industry and the legal industry that supports all of that, looking out at extraordinarily well-paid individuals in the crowd. And somebody used an example of flat screen TVs. And they said, yeah, well, it's all, everybody knew. The very wealthiest got access to the flat screen TVs, and the more people got access to them and more people. And I was frankly offended at that analogy. I'm not comfortable saying, well, the wealthiest will get access, and then if you wait 17 years for the patent to expire, well, your life will be gone, but maybe somebody else who has that disease will be treated. I just can't get comfortable with that. Nor can I get comfortable setting a price, because I know the consequence, I believe strongly the consequence of that will be that innovation will be diminished and there will be future lives that can't be saved. The only way I can square those two is to look at all the people who were in that room who were all extraordinarily wealthy and say, the right price for our pharmaceutical is the price where we can afford it and we can afford to be taxed to provide it for the other people who can't afford it. You'll find some equilibrium price where the extreme wealth of society will pay for access for other people, but nobody will have set that price except the inventors themselves and the companies they work at, where you can simultaneously drive innovation because you're rewarding that innovation and you're taxing people for satisfying that most fundamental human value, which is access to everybody. I think that's a sort of discussion that we've arrived at in areas like national defense, where everybody benefits from the contribution. People pay for that contribution based on their ability to pay for that contribution. I think that's the only way to square the alternate perspectives of the patient who has the disease that can be treated today and the patient who has the disease that still must be innovated to treat 10 years from now. You have to support pricing on the innovation today, and the people who can afford to have to be willing to pay for access. I think I skipped over it earlier, but society will not stand by and just let us continue to innovate and deny access. And I tell my colleagues in the industry, you're dreaming. If you think just continue as we're going, we'll survive, our industry will continue. It will not. Society is saying this is not working. You want to keep getting paid for your innovation, stop kvetching about the taxes that you're paying to provide what you just invented to everybody who can't afford it. So I'll stop with that diatribe and be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Worland, I hope you don't consider this a trick question, because I don't know the answer to it myself, but your initial statement was ethics is don't lie, cheat, and steal. In your mind, what's the difference between ethics and morals? Because I think those terms get used interchangeably, and I'm not sure that they're same, but I don't know the answer to that. So.
Yeah, so I spent a little bit of Google searching and concluded I don't know the answer either. And I honestly have to say I don't know the difference between ethics and morals. And there may well be either a well understood or an important discussion to have there. I'm not qualified to even enter the discussion, frankly. But I know, I tend to blend them and think of them as the same. That there are institutions in place that sort of encapsulate what I would think of as an ethical dilemma as a question of morality. I know that there's research and thinking on that topic that says that they're not the same, but I wouldn't be the person to describe those differences for you. So when I was in San Francisco, I'll brew if anybody else's question, I was particularly struck by all of us in our suits and fancy ties participating in the meeting and all the basically minimum wage workers who were there providing the water and the food and the services and everything. And I basically told the crowd, are you willing to be taxed so that all those people who are walking on the periphery can get access to your health care? I think they found it rather offensive and obnoxious that I would do that. But and I won't look out, but I'll there are people in this room who will be taxed to provide health care for other people in this room. That's an equation I'm comfortable with. If if you bleed me dry so I have no dollars left, I can't do anything beyond there. But I think the drive towards pricing innovation, I believe absolutely that ability to price that reflects the benefit that you're deriving from your invention drives invention. And I also believe fundamentally in my heart, it's not ethical to deny access to somebody whose life you could save because they can't pay for the drug. And the only way I know how to square that is to reach into my pocket and help pay for the other person, because I'm very well paid for having invented the drug. I can afford to share some of my money with somebody else who can't afford the medicine. And you'll find some equilibrium point. There's a question.
Yeah. If you end up in this situation where you're talking about taxation, how then do you merge the second item up there with the fourth item? Because taxation is going to imply government.
Well, it's going to imply government collection of resources. But so I think if you bought insurance plans for people, so I think the Affordable Care Act is not that far off. If you provide dollars to people to buy insurance plans and companies are negotiating with insurance plans for the price of their drugs, that's quite different because the insurance plan doesn't have the mandate of an elected government and can ultimately be compulsory. So I actually think the intermediate here helps in that you're not negotiating with Big Brother who can say, well, I set the price, but you're going to have to somehow collect resources from people who have excess resources to collect them from and provide that through a distributed system for a benefit comes to other people. But I don't think the price discussion should be exclusively with the government. I'm a big fan of letting the government negotiate on Medicare prices. And again, that's an anathema to most of my industry. I see nothing wrong with letting them be a participant in the market mechanism. But if they're the only participant, we know that that's not a functioning market. If they're the only participant and they have the power of law to say, well, we've just set the price, that's not a exchange between arm's length parties at that point. One of them has coercive power over the other one. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be. So I don't think the government can be the sole provider and the only party in the price discussion. But I have no problem with them being one of the parties. And they'll drive prices down, no doubt. But that's okay. When a big entrant, if all of a sudden Walmart is allowed to negotiate, you can see, they drive prices way down. You can ask what are the consequences of that as well. But if a big participant in a market is all of a sudden talking about price, it will drive price down. But they can't unilaterally set the price because there are other participants who are willing to pay more for it.
We're really the only developed country that doesn't have national health insurance. So if we had national health insurance, would we be more conscious as a nation of taking care of ourselves? Would we see it more as a commitment like patriotism to be healthy?
Yeah.
Would we see it as being a patriotic duty to be healthy?
I would love to say I believe that. I'm not sure that I do. I've become jaded a little bit about human behavior and expectations that people will automatically, behave in interest of other people and will comport their own behavior in that manner. I have to say I'm a little bit more jaded. I don't know how to solve this. I do think it's required that people you make some contribution. I think so. If you're going to share in the share access, everybody's got to contribute something. This is why I think the individual mandate is so important. If you have no obligation to contribute, of course you're going to get free riders. It's the old dilemma of the commons, where if you can put your cow out to eat the grass, why would I not eat all the grass? It's the neighbor who's going to suffer. That's been debated for thousands of years, and people don't behave in a way where they restrict their own behavior. So I have to say I don't have confidence that people will do that. I think I said I don't have a solution. Part of the solution is they have to have some skin in the game as well. And you don't want the first $200 of health care to have to come out of your own pocket, because it's that first $200 that is most important for preventing future disease. And if you require them to buy preventive care, you've just bought yourself all sorts of other health care. But at some point they have to participate, and they have to have some incentive to say, if I get healthier, I'll feel it myself. And so that's some sharing of costs. And where it ultimately breaks down, if they can't share the cost, will you really deny them the life-saving medicine? In Steve's world, you won't. So somewhere between patriotism and making them feel some of the pain of contributing, you'll find that messy point where it's far from perfect, but people's lives are saved, and the suckers like me aren't paying for everything.
You shared earlier that you moved from viral to now you're working on cancer treatment. Was that in a way your own moral or ethical decision to move towards that type of treatment?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I have to be honest, and so I come from what's called basic science side of this. I have a Ph.D., not an MD. My primary drive when I wake up at 5 every morning is to solve the puzzle. I'm still addicted to figuring out the thing that I found so exciting when I was 5 years old and put the pieces together. So fundamentally, I have to admit, I found it to be a solvable puzzle. What I didn't want to do was go work. I worked in hepatitis C, and there are patients who are dying of hepatitis B, and we will get cures for them. I did consider that a little trivial on my part, so my banking friends all told me, you can make the most money the fastest, go work in hepatitis B. Everybody knows you. They'll shovel money at you. You can have access to whatever you want to. That's a little trivial. But in picking cancer, it was really, it's the next most complex puzzle that hasn't been solved yet that I think I can contribute to solving. So, and that is a drive that hasn't abated after all these years.